every single day there are weapons being transited through the European Union. In my own country, Ireland, the Irish government has not done one thing to stop the transit of weapons, either Israeli overflights that are using Irish airspace or the US military that is using Shannon Airport. There's also Israeli flights that constantly go through Liège in Belgium as they transport weapons from the US to Israel. The European Union has an association agreement with Israel, which includes a human rights clause. Why have they not activated the human rights clause and cut off trade relations with Israel? Why are they continuing to act as though Israel is upholding international law? The United Nations has consistently documented the violations that are occurring in Palestine. As an international actor, the Palestinian people are continuously over the last 19 months documenting their own genocide in real time. It's not like the European Union member states don't know what's happening. The dogs on the street know what's happening in Gaza. So there's a total lack of political will on the part of these states to take even the most minimal actions. And just to mention again, in the case of Ireland, I mean, it is a completely schizophrenic situation in Ireland because our government has joined the South Africa case against Israel, where Israel is being accused of genocide. So that's the position that Ireland holds. Ireland is preparing arguments to go before the world's top court to argue that what Israel is doing is committing a genocide, while at the same time, Ireland has done absolutely nothing to stop arms that are being transited through Irish territory, whether that is through our airports or through our airspace. It has done absolutely nothing to stop the transit of those arms so that they reach Israel so it can continue to perpetrate what Ireland will argue in court is a genocide. That is a completely schizophrenic position to hold. This is about making money. War is big business, and there's a lot of people getting very rich on these policies of death and destruction. The European Union has been evolving as a military alliance for a number of decades. This has gone in lockstep with the expansion of NATO. Part of the European Union's evolution as a military alliance or a military union has involved allocating European public money to the arms industry. This is because the arms industry has a seat at the decision-making table in Brussels. And we've seen this since 2015, where the European Commission created a group of personalities which was put in place to advise the European Union on what they call defence and security policies. And that group of personalities was very heavily stocked with people who are either working directly for arms companies, arms lobbyists, or arms think tanks. Surprise, surprise, the advice that they gave was that the European Union needed to allocate public money to private arms companies for the research and development of arms. And that is how the European Defence Fund came about. We've seen in the European Union 7-year budgetary cycles that each budgetary cycle means allocating more and more money to basically what is a war industry, creation of research and development pools of money for funding war and militarism. When Donald Trump came into his presidency in the US at the beginning of the year, and he started making noises about reforming NATO or reassessing the relationship with NATO, very quickly, in response to that, the European Union comes along with its unprecedented 800 billion fund for militarization, for further militarization, further spending on weapons. And it very quickly then produces a white paper on Defence Readiness 2030. And it says within that, and I quote, the US demands that Europe take more responsibility for its own defence. And so we see in the US, they say jump, and Europe says how high, and as high as 800 billion, in fact. And within that white paper as well, we also saw NATO being referred to as the cornerstone of collective defence, while a lot of the mainstream media was talking about this kind of pulling away, where Europe was going in one direction, maybe NATO or the US, or there was a kind of a diverging situation in terms of security. I think the European Union is basically responding to the wishes of its master. NATO came about during the Cold War. And when the Cold War ended, the idea was that NATO would also disband. There was no need for a military alliance of the type that NATO is. But in fact, instead of disbanding, NATO began to expand and to move further east, expanding its membership. We've seen in recent years how Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. So NATO is really about territorial expansion, control, dominance. This is for a US imperialist project. And this is one of the greatest sources of instability that we are seeing at the moment in this constant territorial expansion. We even have the expression NATO territory, as though NATO were a state in and of itself, when in fact it's an aggressive military war alliance that does nothing more than contribute to global instability and to war. NATO is a war alliance. NATO is not about keeping people safe. NATO is about waging war. NATO has gone to war in a number of countries for its own interests, imperialist interests, on behalf of the US, on behalf of European powers. So far from keeping us safe, NATO actually puts us at greater risk. And you can ask the people of Iraq, you can ask the people of Libya, you can ask the people of the Balkans if NATO made them safe, or if NATO ended up becoming a war alliance that dropped bombs on civilian populations that put all of us in danger. And it's really about expanding also the amount of money that's being spent on war. And we've seen that with the most recent SIPRI figures that were released. 55% of global military spending is coming from the NATO countries. Most of that is the United States, but the European members are also increasing their military spending. And this is about creating conditions where arms companies get richer and that money that could otherwise be spent on healthcare, housing, education, social needs is being used to line the pockets of the arms industry. And that doesn't make anyone safer. It simply leads to the rich getting richer and people who need to access those services coming up against the kind of austerity measures that we've seen in Europe over the last number of years. And that money instead being sent to war. So you're either on the receiving end of the war machine if you're in Iraq, if you're in Libya, if you're in Ukraine, because the arms that are being exported to Ukraine have done nothing to bring about peace. They've only prolonged war. So if you're in those countries, you're in the direct receiving end of NATO's war machine. If you're in Western Europe or in the United States, the money that your government should be spending on healthcare, on social care, on education, on housing is in fact being funneled into the arms industry. The European Union and NATO have had institutional relations for the last 2 or so decades. NATO is actually written into the legal treaties that underpin the existence of the European Union. It's not an alliance that can be done away with tomorrow. And I think that's something that Europeans have not been fully made aware of because of the undemocratic nature of the European Union in how it's been brought about. We've basically created in Brussels a situation where we have highly undemocratic institutions that are now fully aligned legally, politically, and increasingly now militarily with NATO. And that has not had the approval of any European Union citizens. And we've also seen the European Union expand as a military project. So we've seen the creation of the European Defence Agency. We've seen the rolling out of European Union military missions across the African continent, in parts of the Middle East and the Balkans. We've seen the European Union, expand its territorial control in terms of borders, way down in the Sahel in Africa, where the European Union is calling the shots on how countries should actually control their own borders. And we've also seen the European Union funnel significant amounts of European public money into funding the arms industry. The most recent is the European Defence Fund, which is directly funding research and development of weapons, but we also have the Act in Support of Ammunition Production, which is directly funding the production of ammunition, which also raises serious legal questions because the European Union actually prohibits the use of its public budget for military expenditure. The European Union, as it further aligns with NATO, is really coming into the margins of what is legally permissible by European Union law. And, these are questions for lawyers and for the courts, but it also comes at a time when we see the full scale erosion of international law with what is happening in Israel, where it is committing a genocide against the Palestinian people, and the European Union, instead of complying with international law and calling on its member states to actually uphold the Genocide Convention and prevent that genocide from occurring, the European Union has continued to do business with Israel and promote the idea of doing business with Israel. And we saw a European Union member state as recently as the beginning of April, Hungary, receive Netanyahu in European Union territory. This alliance with NATO goes hand in hand with the erosion of international law and the rolling out of the expression of this rules based international order. But those rules are not written down. There's no rule book that you can go to and consult those rules to see when somebody is in breach of them. It's language that is being used to conceal the fact that they are in front of the world eroding international law. Is any of this going to make us safer? No. What it will do is bring about conditions where we may be much closer to war in Western Europe. If not that, it will certainly mean, further exports of weapons from Europe to wars in Africa, to Israel for a genocide against the Palestinian people, and to other areas around the world that have, for decades, been suffering extreme situations of violence, war, conflict, that are being fueled by European and US manufactured weapons. This is about making money. War is big business, and there's a lot of people getting very rich on these policies of death and destruction that are being fed to the mainstream media and to the general public as policies that will make us safe, when they will in fact do the exact opposite. There is nothing safe about, for example, in Ireland, the Irish government has just acquired Javelin anti tank missiles. What in the name of God is Ireland going to do with anti tank missiles? Who are we going to fire anti tank missiles at? We're also in the process of trying to acquire fighter jets. Why in the name of God would Ireland need fighter jets? Who are we planning on shooting out of the sky with fighter jets? Fighter jets won't make people in Ireland safer. What people in Ireland need to be safe is a house. We're going through an unprecedented housing crisis in Ireland. Our healthcare system is stretched to the brink, and there are people, on trolleys every day of the week in Ireland, in Irish hospitals, that cannot get beds. And our government has decided, let's buy some fighter jets. This is not going to make us safe. This is going to be a horrifically detrimental, either by dragging us into war if they continue the saber rattling that they have been doing, or by creating such economic austerity because money is being fueled into a war industry that people are in a particularly precarious situation with the most basic of human needs, like housing, like healthcare, education.